and I'm talking with jazz violinist, composer, arranger, and just a very extraordinary human being by the name of Jean Luc Ponty. How you doing this morning?
I'm fine, thank you very much.
Tell me a little bit just how you managed to get started in music and some of the instruments you played, and just a little bit about your background.
Sure. Well, I grew up in a family of musicians. Both my parents were music teachers, and so I got an early start. However, it doesn't mean you necessarily become a professional musician because your parents were, but in my case, I had the vocation very early. I had a passion for music from a very young age, and in fact, my father gave me a violin at 3 or 4 years old, and he started me teaching me seriously at 5. And my mother was a piano teacher, and she taught me piano at 5 as well. So, but I loved it. It became a passion very, very fast, and so I decided, I mean, that was my goal, my vocation was always to become a professional musician. So they sent me to, I was born in France. I grew up in a small town in Normandy. In fact, I was born during the war, and I was 2 years old when the Allies, American and Canadian and U.S. troops disembarked. So these were rough times. But anyway, I grew up fine, and so they sent me to Paris because that was the only city in France where there was a very serious school of music for young professionals. And I studied classical violin, and while I was studying classical violin, I was going out in town, and some friends who were jazz fans already introduced me to the music and took me out to jazz clubs. And in those days, these were the late 50s, early 60s. There was quite a jazz scene in Paris. It was almost like being in New York in the 40s, you know. There were a lot of jazz clubs, and there were several great American jazz musicians who were living in Europe, either in Paris or other cities around, like Bud Powell, on the great pianist, and Kenny Clarke, the drummer, Dexter Gordon, and so Johnny Griffin as well, and that was a great way to be introduced to jazz. So what happened is I also had learned to play a little bit of clarinet, and there was a students' band from one of the university. They were not professional musicians, and they were not studying music. I think it was like maybe what was it? Political science or scientific school, whatever. But they had a jazz band, and they were looking for a clarinet player. The style was like Benny Goodman's, the swing style, you know.
Okay.
And I did not know anything about jazz, but they hired me because I had a good ear and I could improvise right from the first audition.
Would you say that you had perfect pitch or relative pitch?
I guess so. I guess I had perfect pitch because they would play a tune, and I would start improvising some notes on it, and they hire me immediately. They said, you know nothing about jazz, because you know they had a list of jazz standards that they put out in front of me, and they asked me if I knew any. All the jazz standards that were in vogue in these years, you know, 50s, 60s, mostly from Broadway music halls. And all jazz musicians around the world that was the Bible, you know. But I did not know any of those because I had not really learned how to play jazz until then. So that's why they said, okay, you know nothing about jazz, but you have a good ear, you can improvise, so we hire you. And for me, it was really just to have fun, and they were playing for parties, you know, and for me I thought it would be a great way to meet girls. And
I hear you.
But the thing is, yes, I met girls, but I also developed a passion for the music more and more, because I discovered the whole history of jazz. And in those days, Miles Davis had John Coltrane in his band, and John Coltrane just left Miles Davis's band and started his own band. And I saw them in concert in Paris. I saw John Coltrane twice in concert in Paris. So modern jazz really suddenly opened my mind and made me discover that the music was very sophisticated and it was a great form of music. And that's when I decided to switch to violin, because I had much more technical abilities on the violin than I did on clarinet. So once I really became serious about jazz, I started playing jazz on violin and going around jazz clubs and jamming with all different bands around town. And they all encouraged me to go on, because I was the only violinist playing bebop or modern style at the time. Of course, I had not heard of the previous violinists, really. I discovered them later, and I loved Stuff Smith in particular, whose approach on the violin was just like a horn player. He had a lot more punch than all the other violinists I had heard in jazz. And of course, Stéphane Grappelli, who was French, was also an example. However, not musically. Really, I was not really attracted to play the way he did, although I admired the way he did it. But his style was, there was a whole new generation of jazz musicians coming in from America who really impressed me, and that's what I wanted to do.
Well, let me ask you: had you had any exposure at all to Claude Fiddler Williams?
To whom?
Fiddler Williams. He's from here in Kansas City. Was he?
Oh no, much later.
Okay.
It's when I moved to the States in the 70s and started touring that I came to Kansas City a few times, and yes, that's how I heard of him.
Okay.
And saw him play too.
During your excursion here in the United States, you said you did some touring with Stéphane Grappelli. Did you play here once with Stéphane?
No, I was never on tour with him. I discovered him in Paris.
I see.
And we did a few gigs together. We were hired to play on television in France and Germany, in Europe only.
Okay.
I never did anything with him in the States.
Okay. At what point did you? You already switched over, pretty much decided you were going to play jazz on violin. And you mentioned that your ability to express yourself on violin was probably greater than it was on say the woodwind instruments you played. Did you consider it much of a risk to make that decision to switch to jazz?
Yeah. I really wanted to do it, but I wasn't sure because, especially at the time and in Europe, there was no clue. There was no way to know what the future would hold for a jazz musician in Europe, especially as a European jazz musician, because jazz coming from America, there was not much original jazz being created in Europe at the time. A few. But rarely.
Okay.
Yes, Django Reinhardt and Grappelli, that was very original indeed.
Okay.
But it was not like it was really mostly coming from the U.S. So the U.S. musicians were really in demand, and to go into jazz especially a violinist on top of it was really it sounded very risky to everyone around me and myself included. But I was, I must say, it's just destiny, I guess, because I was hired in a jazz club in Paris called the Blue Note, which was probably the top club, and that was the first step, and that led to other steps that just came on my way. I was offered to record an album. My very first solo album for Philips, which became Universal later. And then that album was very successful in Europe, and I was invited to play in jazz festivals. Okay. And I was 21 years old, and I was playing jazz for only 2 years or 3 years. So I got so much demand suddenly that, I said, okay, I will quit classical because I was already hired by symphony orchestra by the time I was 21. But I had to make a choice because I couldn't keep doing both anyway. And, I told myself I was 21 years old, very young, and I could try to play jazz for about 6 years, and if it didn't work, I could always come back to classical music.
Right.
And obviously I never did. From then on, the adventure kept going in ways I never expected.
Well, it's obvious that people like yourself and Grappelli have influenced another generation or so of violinists exploring jazz and and performing and recording. Who do you like out there that's playing now that's come along behind you?
Regina Carter, and she really has something on stage. I had the chance to do a duet with her once. And there is a young guy whom I recommended to Stanley Clarke a few years ago, Matt Stalling.
Okay.
Because Stanley loves the violin, and he asked me if I could recommend a young guy, like somehow a beginner, someone who was a good improviser, but was not yet really matured totally as a musician. I guess the idea was to from him to have someone who would really adapt to his band and his music. And I had done a master class at the Berklee School of Music, and I had noticed 2 or 3 really good young violinists. And that guy in particular I thought would fit well with Stanley because he was also using effects and electric sounds besides being a good acoustic player. So he was more a complete player than most of them. And indeed, he fits very well there. There are not that... There is a young guy also in the New York area, Zach Braun, who's really good.
Okay.
And I guess it's only starting now. I think there will be more and more really good young musicians, violinists, jazz violinists.
Well, I just wanted you to know that several years ago, and it was definitely several years ago, I had the pleasure of interviewing the late Noel Pointer, and he talked.
Oh yes, sure.
And he talked very highly of you,
Noel. I didn't mention him because you asked me the young generation.
Right.
Of today, but yeah, it's too bad he passed away. Noel was very talented.
Yeah, he's definitely gone too soon, but I just wanted to mention that to you because, since it's our first time having a chance to have a chat, but it was somebody who, while I'd had, only kind of scant exposure to your recordings, he definitely talked very highly of Stefan Grappelli, but when it came to, I mentioned your name, I mean, he spent a good half hour singing your praises. So, but let me ask you this: after you came to the USA, and you got exposed to somebody who and got to play with somebody who I just interviewed a couple of weeks ago, and that was George Duke.
Oh,
and
sure.
He talked very highly of you as well, still does. Talk about your experiences that you had with him and Frank Zappa.
Well, to understand why we were both with Frank Zappa, I first have to explain, I don't know if George did, but we started playing together, George and me, in California, because I had been invited to come to the States for the first time in 1967 by John Lewis of the Modern Jazz Quartet, who then was musical director of the Monterey Jazz Festival in California.
Right.
And when I played there, Richard Buck, who had founded the Pacific Jazz label in Los Angeles, offered me a recording contract, that brought me to Los Angeles the following year in '68, and again in '69. And it was too complicated and expensive to come with my band from France, so I had a few gigs lined up, jazz festivals and clubs and jazz clubs on the West Coast first. And so I needed to find a band, and George Duke was a young guy like me, beginner as well, but he had a trio, and he had sent a demo to Richard Buck, that guy who was heading the Pacific Jazz label. And Richard Buck told me, listen to this guy, I think he would fit great with you. And as soon as I heard the demo, it's fantastic. So we met just a few hours before going on stage in a club at Dante's in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
And without rehearsing, we just jammed, on jazz standards. And the affinity, it was unbelievable.
Right.
I mean, the musical understanding was fantastic from the first note.
Mm-hmm.
So we really enjoyed playing so much together that we kept doing. He was on every recording I did for that label, and Richard Buck was pushing me to do collaboration that would take me outside of mainstream jazz.
Mm-hmm.
And he's the one who arranged the meeting with Frank Zappa.
Okay.
Frank accepted to produce my next solo album at the time in 1969, which was King Kong. And Frank was responsible for hiring all the musicians. He was writing the music, he was arranging, so he was hiring all the musicians. And my only demand was to have George with me. And that's how George met Frank Zappa.
Mm-hmm.
And Frank, was so impressed that I flew back to France, but he called George to tour in his band. And then he called me, Zappa called me a few years later, in 1973, to also tour in his band. Mm-hmm. And that's how we were both, George and me, touring with Zappa.
Would you say was there any difference in your ability to communicate musically with musicians here as opposed to in France, or was it all pretty much universal?
No, it was pretty much, it was universal because the sources were the same, my early influences in jazz were the whole bebop and hard bop and post-bop.
Mm-hmm.
Movement. So Clifford Brown, Bill Evans, Herbie Hancock,
Mm-hmm.
The Miles bands with even the early bands from Miles going through after Coltrane. So basically we had the same sources of influences when I came to the States as American musicians.
Mm-hmm.
But being in the States and being in the culture and with the I met also some great innovators in jazz. What made me understand even that music even better,
Mm-hmm.
than just hearing it from Europe, if you like.
Do you play much? I know you do a lot of touring in Europe, and of course that's where that's where you're calling from. Do you play much here anymore in the United States? And the only reason why I ask that is, in doing my research about jazz fusion, as much as I loved it myself, grew up listening, and always, tried to play as much as I can, as well as the standards. I'm just wondering. I noticed that it seems to be much more popular. The music itself is much more popular in Europe.
No, it's just a matter of I don't know. It depends. I have not toured much in Europe for all the years after I moved to America. For my God, I moved in '73 till the '90s.
Mm-hmm.
I would say mid-'90s. I rarely toured in Europe. I toured a lot in South America,
Mm-hmm.
Canada, and the States especially, but not much in Europe. It has changed because now there are a lot of countries since the Iron Curtain disappeared, and all these countries that were under communist regimes who suddenly had access to all the Western culture. It was, so there were fans, which I didn't know, but I discovered by going to perform in these countries, like Eastern Europe, all over Eastern Europe, and all the way to Russia, It's amazing. So that's why I'm very busy touring over here. Otherwise, there is still as much demand, and I think that some fusion musicians are still very popular in the States.
Okay.
And as for Europe, I would say that the movement itself, it's jazz fusion in general, is not more popular than other styles now.
Okay.
But it depends in which countries, though. It varies.
Just like anything else.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's more a matter of individual success.
Well,
some musicians from the fusion era are still very successful, and others disappeared once the novelty effect started to fade.
Yeah, just like anything else.
Exactly.
You played for a while with John McLaughlin in the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and how did that help you with your evolution musically?
Oh, it was a great experience. It was a great experience, and I would say that John and myself were kind of in the same cultural background and came from the same background somehow. He grew up in England, learned a lot of classical music, but very quickly discovered blues and jazz, and so did I. And he was writing such original music. His band was so original that it was very exciting for me to be asked to tour with them. Great player to very intense, and that made me a stronger player. To tour with Zappa was already great, but the thing is, Zappa was a bit prisoner of his image as a rock singer with a satire, and so he was good at writing instrumental music too, but he was losing his audience, kind of. If he played too many instrumentals, then he was losing his audience. They came for the funny lyrics and the songs. So I ended up really playing one solo a night, and the rest of the time I was playing backgrounds for different songs. So, and a year after that, I was of touring with Zappa. I was called by John McLaughlin, and there the name of the game was playing instrumental music. There was nothing else, and suddenly I was on stage next to him, and we were exchanging solos and trading and improvisation and so forth, and there was a very intense touring schedule. The whole year we were touring, so playing so often, being on stage almost every night next to such an intense player was indeed very stimulating for me.
Was Billy Cobham with Mahavishnu at the time that you played with John McLaughlin?
No, it's right after.
Right after he left.
And what I learned later when I met Billy is that, and John in fact, is that they were thinking of me for the first version of the band when they started. But at the time I was still living in France, and they thought it'd be too difficult, too complicated, so they abandoned the idea of calling me, and they found Jerry Goodman, who did a great job. I felt he fitted that band very well. But so Billy I met later, and we were talking about forming a band together at some point, in fact, but it didn't happen. So I was with the second version of the Mahavishnu Orchestra with Narada Michael Walden on drums, who became the famous record producer,
Right.
Whitney Houston and others, and Ralph Armstrong on bass. That he was 17 years old, 17 years old at the time, coming from Detroit, and he played in my band a few years later.
What kind of new projects do you have now? I noticed you've had a more African influence or some African elements in your music. Will you continue that with what you're doing now, or what you got coming up later on down the road?
Not really. I did a couple of albums since 2000. I did more than a couple, but there were some live projects that were released, so they don't really count as new projects, if you like. But the 2 albums, that's one of the reasons why I spent a lot of time in Europe. Is I kept 2 of the African musicians with whom I did a project in the 90s. You know, Gin Sangé on bass, who is originally from Cameroon, and Tafa Cissé on percussion, who is from Senegal. And but I must say that yes, there is still a rhythmic influence in the arrangements, and because they are in the rhythm section. But the music, I came back to what I'm used to do. You know, I came back more to my style of which I started in the 70s, in fact. And the latest album, the Atacama Experience, is according to those who heard it. I saw some reviews, and many people feel it's. They hear my style from the 70s. They compare it to Enigmatic Ocean.
Yeah.
But in a more modern way, and the rhythm section is different. You know, there is the energy is different, but it's very dancing, if you like. I like these rhythms a lot. So, I mean, it would be silly for me to exclusively, to keep producing projects that are totally influenced by African music. It's not really my culture, but the experience has made a very strong mark, and it's you can hear it somehow, even though I come back to my writing style.
Well, I tell you what, I really appreciate having the time to sit back and chat with you about you and your music, and because this is something I've been wanting to do since I was.
Well, you're welcome. My pleasure.
And after once somebody turned me on to what you were doing, in the studio and live as well. Never did I think that I'd be sitting on the other end of a phone line with you, but it's been a wonderful experience for me and for my listeners.
Thank you.
I've been talking with Jean Luc Ponty, violinist extraordinaire, and thank you very much for your time, sir.
You're welcome.
All right, take care.
You're welcome. By the way, do you have a copy of this Atacama Experience?
Yes, I do. And I'm pretty much wearing out the grooves on it. So that, along with Cosmic Messenger, I get the station gets a lot of requests for the title track.
Still?
Very much so. And also Mystical Adventures and